We're going to start poly painting our model, and I'm going to switch to a wax material, and I have this wax material set at a really low wax setting so that it still looks a bit waxy, but just it doesn't look like candle wax. And this gives me a good base to work with because it sort of resembles skin. It's not perfect, and but it's decent. And what you'll find me do a lot while I'm poly painting is I constantly switch between this wax material and the flat material so that I know what I'm painting. The first thing I normally do is I use the spatter mode, and I'm gonna start spattering skin tones on his body, and I've set the color variance on my brush so that there is still some variance in color when I'm painting on this guy. You can see that some blues and some greens are actually showing up. It's very subtle, you don't really see it, and that's the whole point. If you really want some subtle variation while we are poly painting this guy. I've intentionally left some of that white so that it still shows through, and it's interesting because it actually gives it a sort of mottling effect. We want to be careful though, because we still want to make sure majority of his body is covered in this skin tone. So I'm going to select a different alpha. And this alpha is going to help me create a more random effect. It's just a standard spatter alpha you find in ZBrush, and it's really good because it spatters a lot of dots over your model. Again, you want to be careful with your color variance there. I'm just going to lower my color variance so that some of that variance still shows up. You can see that the green is actually showing up there. And I'm really not too concerned at this point of time, because the whole philosophy behind this process is to keep on layering layers of color in the same way airbrushing works. Select the eyes. I'm gonna give the eyes a black color, and maybe give it like a really glossy look. It's almost as if he has shark eyes. For his teeth, we're gonna give him some coffee stained teeth, perhaps. Maybe this guy has been drinking too much coffee. Just a quick hint of color. I'm not going to spend too much time on his teeth at this point of the poly painting process. I really want to be focusing more on the skin. I'll switch to a slightly redder tone here. And again, I'm going to switch to the spatter alpha. Playing around with the intensity values. And I'm going to start adding some red tones to this guy on the tip of his ears, perhaps even trying to simulate some of that subsurface scattering, or maybe just because there are more veins in his ears. I don't really have a scientific process behind this. I really just paint whatever I think looks good, and it's also helpful to have reference around so that you can refer to it when you need to. You know, as they say, nature is the best source of reference. Some red tones on his chest. And you can see it's slowly but surely it's coming together. And adding those red tones is just some kind of variation to his skin tones. Slowly working on his head now. Working on his nostrils. Some areas are pretty obvious. You want them to be a darker red. For instance, his eyes or his eye bags, the area around his eyes especially. That would definitely add more visual interest to the area. I think that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to start painting these red tones around his eyes, and maybe even in his nostrils. Maybe this guy hasn't had much sleep. That's why he's drinking so much coffee. Working on his neck now. I'm going to spread out that red so that it encompasses a larger area. Adding more red to his ears, definitely on the insides and as well as the tips of his ears. And the way I work is when I'm looking at this model, sometimes it's just about evaluating and figuring out what needs attention. And I'm always bouncing between different areas. With this red tone, how I'm using it is I'm looking at areas where I feel that start to look, areas that look bland, for instance, area that needs some kind of variation in color, and that's when I go in with this brush. It really helps me add more variation to his skin tone. Gonna use cavity masking over here, and I've quickly masked all the crevices on this guy. And I'm gonna invert that mask, and I'm gonna select a dark brown color, and I'm gonna use this color and start hitting all the wrinkles and crevices, um, keeping in mind not to go too crazy on them. And I'm gonna tweak the Z intensity so that I have something that's not too intense. Switching over to the flat material, and this gives me a good indication of what I'm actually painting, because this is essentially how the diffuse map looks like. And cavity masking is a really good way to create detail in your poly paint, and I use it often, especially when I want to start painting in the wrinkles, for instance, or maybe even masking out the wrinkles and painting on his skin surface without affecting the wrinkles. It's a really cool way of painting, and you can also blur your cavity masking, and that gives you even more control and even a different look when you start painting on your model. I'm switching back to the wax material, and I'm going to select an alpha here, perhaps something with some noise, some like a generic pattern, for instance. See if this works. I'm going to switch to the spatter mode, and if it doesn't work, it's always good to try and see what works. And this is a perfect example of that. I'm looking for an alpha that's going to give me a nice mottling effect, if you will, on his skin. And when I'm stuck on something, or if I run into some kind of mental block when it comes to creating art, or when I'm sculpting, what I do is I just move on to the next area and just work on another part of the model, and over time I find that this helps, because I can always return to whatever was giving me problems, and I feel like by then I've already figured out a way of achieving a certain look, or sculpting it in a certain way. I don't try to force myself onto the model, and I work in a very non-linear way per se. I just like to hit different parts of the model as and when I feel like it. Gonna start painting in his nostrils, giving it a slightly darker tones in there. Blending the area between his lips and his gums. Adding some tones to his gums. And I'm adding some darker red tones to his neck as well. And this color, it's not really a red, I would say it's more of like a maroon color. I'm just gonna start adding that color all over his body. Again, the purpose of that is just to add more randomness, and over time, once we start hazing layers of color onto this model, it's gonna really give it that realistic look. You can see he's starting to look better now. And again, I'm switching to the flat material just to check what I've painted. Using the spatter brush a lot here, and this is the spatter mode in under brushes, I believe. And there's a whole bunch of controls you can use there. You've got your color variants, and you've got your intensity variants as well. And I'm going to switch over to a desaturated blue, and this is going to give me more control, maybe even start bringing more personality to this creature. You can see that once I did that, it's starting to give him a more dead look, almost like a more fiendish look to him. And it's pretty interesting to see what the blue does. It doesn't. It gives it some variation in color. It makes things interesting. And once we start adding more layers of color, that blue is gonna slowly fade off to the back. It's not gonna be so intense as we see it now. And what I do a lot as well is I use the color picker and I pick a color on the model, and I do this when I feel like I need to blend colors together. I'm gonna switch to a desaturated green, and gonna start working on some of these veins, and I'm gonna be careful not to overdo it. I just want a really subtle hit of green on his veins. The first part of the poly painting process is pretty much done now, and that was to create a base coat for our creature. We're going to add more details on him, stuff like veins, moles, and another layer of mottling, and that is really going to help tie in that realistic look.